Welcome to Season 2 of The Evolution of Torah, a podcast with JTS professor Rabbi Mordecai Schwartz. In this season, Establishing Rabbinic Culture, Professor Schwartz traces the development of medieval Jewish legal literature through a journey to 4 key centers of learning across North Africa and Europe. This is episode 3, in which we travel to France to learn about the great commentator Rashi and his descendants.
In this episode of our podcast, we will point out the differences in the learning culture in France from that of Muslim Spain and North Africa that we talked about in the last episode. In order to illustrate this difference most clearly, I want to present a story that we have in the responsa of one of the 2 major figures that we presented in the last episode, Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi. In responsum number 223, he relates the following question presented to him by a small community in Spain. Alfasi presents the following case. Reuben and his wife and sons originally lived in eastern France, many days' journey from Spain. Reuben left his wife and sons in their native place and was content to wander through the communities in the land of Spain. He came to a certain province in Spain and preached in public. When 5 of the leaders of the community met him, they urged him to bring his wife and sons to that province and dwell among them and become their rabbi. But Reuben hesitated because his wife was far away and the expense of bringing his family would be great. But they continued to try to persuade him, and he ultimately agreed. They contracted with him. They agreed to give him 24 gold pieces every year for a term of 3 years. And he agreed to read before them halakha, Mishnah, and scriptures, and to preach the weekly portion, and to do whatever else they agreed upon by formal contract, in writing, and in the presence of witnesses. The Rif goes on to detail Reuben's moving and his beginning the process of teaching. One of the community members, Issachar, doesn't like the way Reuben teaches and refuses to pay the agreed upon amount. Alfasi answers, siding with the community against Issachar. Quote, "We see the conditions of the contract are strong and valid, and that it is obligatory upon you to fulfill the conditions that you made between you. As for Issachar, who changed his mind and does not wish to fulfill the contract which he agreed to, together with his fellows, he has not done right." The Rif goes on to discuss the matter in depth, relating it to the Talmudic sources. But I think it fulfills our purpose well enough without going any further into the matter, and Muslim Spain to set this conflict in motion. JTS professor Jonathan Milgram puts this difference quite well. Quote, "Unlike commentary in Muslim Spain, which focused on the interpretation of Talmud for the purpose of fleshing out practical law, the Northern European interpretive project included commenting on those parts of Talmud that were not of any practical import, including tractates from the orders of Kodashim and Torot, dealing with matters of the temple sacrifices and ritual impurity, respectively. The result of this theoretical approach that Professor Milgram describes would eventually find its highest form in the revolution in learning that the Tosafot, Rashi's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, brought forward, as we shall see later in the episode. The Rif's responsum in this case is from a slightly earlier point of time. However, we can see in it already a difference of approach in France that may not have been palatable to some Spanish Jews. The pillar of French rabbinic tradition is Rashi. According to tradition, Rashi, whose name is an acronym for Rabbi Shlomo ben Yitzchak, Solomon son of Isaac, was born in northern France in Troyes in 1040 and died there in 1105. His Talmud commentary came to supersede every other one, before or since. Rashi's commentary was already popular in his lifetime and had an unprecedented dissemination. Within a century of his death, his commentary had spread from the communities of France and Germany to Spain and Africa and to Asia and even to Babylonia. Rashi studied in the academies of Mainz and Worms with the greatest scholars of his day. Around 1075, he returned to Troyes and opened his own academy. According to tradition, he earned his living from wine making. Rashi's commentary seems to have covered almost the entire Talmud. However, and this may surprise people, when I say it. Rashi's commentary on the Talmud, despite its enormous popularity, hasn't survived in its entirety. For instance, we do not have most of his commentary on Bava Batra, and to this day, if you open a printed copy of that tractate to the 3rd chapter, you will discover that instead of Rashi, the commentary for the remainder of the tractate was written by his grandson, Rashbam, Shmuel ben Meir, who lived from 1085 to 1158. It's also clear that Rashi's commentary went through a process of heavy editing during the Middle Ages. For instance, we have several different versions of his commentary to Chulin. Rashi's commentary is referred to as an ad locum, or al-atar commentary, meaning Rashi is most interested in interpreting the specific passage that he is reading at that moment and not relating to other passages in the Talmud. Also, he will often clarify the meaning of difficult words in the text and indicate their Old French equivalents. In fact, scholars of Old French study Rashi in order to get the meanings of Old French words. He frequently points to later places in the Talmudic chapter or tractate that may be relevant to the current discussion. He also scrupulously avoids issuing halachic rulings in the commentary, at least the vast majority of the time. In the Middle Ages, his commentary usually circulated in parchment pamphlets, often bound with simple vellum covers instead of actual wood or leather bookboards. This is the medieval equivalent of a paperback. The term for this sort of vellum-bound manuscript in the rabbinic Hebrew of the period is kuntras, which is how the Tosafot often refer to Rashi. They'll say that something is written in the kuntras. Since the advent of the Babylonian Talmud's printing in 1484, every edition of the Talmud has been printed with Rashi's commentary in the margin. In the next generation, scholars known as the Ba'alei Tosafot, the authors of the notes, meaning notes on the Talmud, among them Rashi's grandchildren and great-grandchildren, engaged in a veritable revolution in the interpretation of the Talmud. They treated the entire Talmud as if it was a single book that could have no contradictions. The outcome was an agenda where they would harmonize the conflicting and contradictory Talmudic discussions that occur throughout the Talmud. The project of the Tosafot affected the way Jewish legal analysis would be conducted for the next millennium. The implications of this methodology for practical laws was evidenced both in the codes and also in the responsa authored by the second generations of the authors of the Tosafot. Unlike Rashi, who developed a localized approach based on presenting plain meaning when commenting on each individual Talmudic discussion, the Tosafot view Talmudic discussions from different interpretive angles and imagine a diversity of possible meanings that the argumentation could have. A major feature of the method, and likely its most distinguishing characteristic, is the dialectical approach employed for harmonizing contradictions between passages in the Talmud. They make conceptual distinctions between the contradictory material in one Talmudic text and its counterpart in another in order to resolve the issues that they raised. The Tosafot do this not only to come to the most compelling understanding of the material, but also to present as many understandings as possible to the reader. The Tosafot's approach to dealing with contradiction appears in stark contrast to earlier methods. For the Gaonim, for example, contradictory conclusions in the Talmud were able to coexist because long-standing traditions deemed some Talmudic discussions dominant and authoritative, while others, even if parallel, were relegated to having a secondary status and could be ignored. For the Tosafot, on the other hand, contradictions in the text of the Talmud can't exist. It's against the rules. Accordingly, the Tosafot distinguish themselves by concentrating their method on addressing Talmudic contradictions and harmonizing them. They collect, compare, and highlight contradictions and create a meeting place where parallel passages can converse with one another. Thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, this is their method and their goal. At times, the interpretations of the Tosafot are presented as challenges to the comments offered by Rashi. As a result of the Tosafot's reactions to Rashi, scholars debate whether Rashi's commentary spawned the movement of the Tosafot. About 95% of the interpretive material in the Tosafot is the product of two rabbis. Rashi's grandson, Rabbi Yaakov ben Meir of Ramperupt, known as Rabbeinu Tam, who lived from 1100 to 1171, and his relation, Rabbi Yitzchak of Dampierre, known as the Ri Hazaken, who died in 1189. Rabbeinu Tam developed the method, and Rabbi Yitzchak, the Ri Hazaken, applied it to the entire Talmud. In the text of the Tosafot, however, it is virtually impossible to separate the voices of the two. One explanation as to why the collection is referred to as Tosafot is because they are, in fact, student notes. Tosafot. Most of what we have of the Tosafot comes to us through the notes of the Ri Hazaken's four main students. By the year 1200, it would seem the entire Talmud had been reinterpreted through the method we described before. A short word about Rabbeinu Tam. Most of what we have in the Tosafot from Rabbeinu Tam is actually second-hand, or perhaps more rightly, third-hand, through the students of the Ri Hazaken. However, we do have some of Rabbeinu Tam's own writing. Rabbeinu Tam's Sefer HaYashar is made up of two parts: novel interpretations of passages in the Talmud in one volume, and responsa in another. Each was edited and published separately. Although this work was not popular, Rabbeinu Tam himself was quite known. For example, Ibn Daud, the author of Sefer HaKabbalah, seems not to have heard of Rashi, not know who Rashi even was, but he did know about Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam is also associated with a series of assemblies in France and Germany in which a constituted body of rabbis voted and passed enactments for their communities. He even seems to have held an organizing and leadership role. Which assemblies he presided over is less certain. His brother Shmuel ben Meir, the Rashbam, and other important rabbis who are mentioned in the Tosafot are also participants. These conclaves discussed the logistics of collecting taxes and impositions from the Holy Roman Empire on the Jews and highlight the precarious position of medieval Jews, which we've talked about before. Next time we'll deal with Maimonides, the Rambam, in a single episode dedicated only to him and to his works.
Thanks for listening to The Evolution of Torah with Professor Mordecai Schwartz. It was recorded at JTS by Christopher Hickey and produced by Ellie Gettinger, with editing assistance from Sarah Brown. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. For those who want to dig a little deeper, visit jtsa.edu/podcasts, where you'll find sources, archival material, and more in the Evolution of Torah show notes, along with links to all of JTS's podcasts, exploring Jewish text, history, culture, and experience.